Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this event, especially on sort of short notice. But thank you so much. It's great to see all of you guys here today, both from the Secular Student Alliance at Michigan and all of the people from the outside who have come. My name is Monica, and I am the president of the Michigan Secular Student Alliance. And the Michigan Secular Student Alliance is currently the only group on campus that focuses specifically on atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, and other non-religious people on campus. We are associated with 3 different national secularist organizations: the National Secular Student Alliance, which has affiliates all over the country just like ours, the Center for Inquiry, and Volunteers Beyond Belief. And our main goal here on campus is to create a cohesive, supportive, and fun group, a fun community for non-believers on campus. And we do community service. We've gone to Detroit and helped fix up neighborhoods there. We went to a rabbit rescue shelter the other week, and that was really fun. What else do? We have social events and get all the non-believers in the group together and just hang out and have fun and talk about philosophy or talk about life and just have a good time. And the other thing that we do, and this is one of the most important things that we've done in our group, is that we sponsor debates and speakers that spark interesting discussions both amongst our members and between different groups on campus. And we are very glad and honored today to have Dan Barker with us to do that today. And for many of you here, Dan needs no introduction. But for those of you who are not familiar with him, Dan was a preacher for many years, and then he left the faith and became an atheist activist. He's currently the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the author of the book Godless: How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists. He is also a musician, and he travels around the country doing debates and speaking on topics relevant to secularism and irreligion. And today he will speak on the topic, "Did Jesus really rise from the dead?" So please join me in welcoming Dan Barker.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, SSA of Michigan, for all your hard work and your activism, your concern for science, for learning, for rationality, and for real human values. It's nice. It's exciting. It's more than nice. It's exciting, isn't it? Some of you old-timers. We have some people here from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, including some life members, Barnett's and others. And it's kind of encouraging, isn't it, to see these younger group coming up with, and they're doing it on their own. It's not like our groups are going out and proselytizing and turning the colleges into a mission field for atheism. It's the student groups themselves, bottom up, bubbling up, and sometimes these groups start in the country and they think they're the only one. They want to fight back, and they learn, wow, there's hundreds and hundreds of others. There's more than 400 groups in the Secular Student Alliance, and they share resources now. And this tour that I'm on right now is sponsored by the Secular Student Alliance and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I was up in Mount Pleasant last night, and tomorrow night I'll be up in Alma. Is that how you say it? Alma, up north, Alma College. And last Thursday I was in Windsor. Some of you were at the debate in Windsor. A couple of you were there. There were more than 400 people in a huge room, co-sponsored by the Windsor Essex County Atheist Society and InterVarsity. InterVarsity is a Christian organization. And my opponent, Joe Boot, was late because he was in a car accident. Apparently his God wanted me to talk, because while waiting for him, I gave a big talk about state-church separation, the importance of separating religion and government. So, and Joe was good, Joe was nice, but at the end he kind of blew it by saying that he is convinced that we all descended from Noah, that the earth was created just a few thousand years ago, and that even Darwin said there are no transitional fossils, so he lost it on that, I think. Most of the audience members thought he did. The Freedom from Religion Foundation is a national organization based in Madison, Wisconsin. We started in the mid-1970s, working for 2 things: to keep separate church and state, and to educate the public about the views of non-believers. Just like Monica said, atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, whatever you call yourself. We don't care what label people put on themselves. What we say is we all disbelieve in the same God. So I don't think I need this, do I? Can I walk over here? You can hear me okay if I just talk like this? Okay, that's better. We do that with legal actions. We have 4 full-time attorneys. We take lawsuits. We have 12 cases in the courts right now. We send out literally thousands of letters every year. Well, more than 1,000 letters each year. We had almost 2,500 complaints from around the country of violations of state-church separation. And we sometimes have, we had more than 150 victories correcting abuses of state-church separation without going to court, just by the persuasion of a letter, which is pretty neat. Mayors, superintendents of school districts, high school principals, government people who are breaking the law, disobeying the Constitution, and disabusing their office to promote religion. And it's so nice when we get a response back after they've consulted with their legal counsel that they're going to change their practice. So we like doing that, and our attorneys love doing that. Andrew's one of our new attorneys. He's 30. He said, "I've got the best job in the world." He's solving a problem. Just last week he was saying he stopped some middle schoolers from bullying a young girl who was an atheist. They were pushing her head against the wall. They were screaming at her that she's going to hell if she doesn't go to church with them. And so the mother complained, but the principal wasn't doing much about it until Andrew wrote a letter and reminded them. So the principal sent out a memo and met with all the teachers, and then they met with all the students and talked about recognizing diversity and not bullying and letting people think their own thoughts. And now that girl can hold her head up now because the principal and the superintendent has told the students what they were doing was wrong. You might disagree with your classmates, but you can't bash their head against the wall because you have a disagreement. So we're suing the IRS. We have 3 lawsuits in the court right now challenging, well, my favorite lawsuit right now is we're challenging the housing exclusion. Do you know what that is? Ministers of the gospel, priests, pastors, rabbis don't have to report their housing as income. Did you know that? Their housing, their rent, if their church or religious organization gives them a housing allowance, then it's not even an exemption. It's not a deduction. It's an exclusion. They don't even put it on their tax form. Wouldn't you love to have a break like that? Wouldn't you love to just take all your rent and say, nope, that's not income, and just lower your tax liabilities? We think that's unconstitutional. I used to take that break when I was a preacher. Now that I'm working for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, I don't get that break. It's a nonprofit organization. Who's to say that ministers of the gospel, some of them might be doing some good things. Who's to say what they're doing is any better than the American Red Cross or secular organizations that are actually doing real charitable work? Why do they get this break and other groups don't? So we're challenging the IRS. The government, the IRS, filed a brief to challenge our standing. That's the big thing they do these days. Not to argue the merits of the case, but try to kick you out because you don't have the right to sue. We've actually lost a few cases on standing in the past, so we're very sensitive about that. We didn't lose on the merits. The Supreme Court didn't tell us that what George Bush was doing was right. The Supreme Court told us, you just can't sue because you didn't show the proper injury. So, to show injury, in this case, the Freedom from Religion Foundation has stipulated, for me and Annie Laurie, we're co-presidents, they have stipulated a housing allowance for us. It doesn't change anything, it's just on paper. But we now have a housing allowance that we don't get to exclude. And a couple months ago, the federal judge said our standing is strong because of that. They can't throw us out on standing. So the case is going to proceed, and watch for it. It's kind of under the radar now, but if we win that case, can you imagine? There's about 500,000 clergy in this country, and they're going to have to pay more taxes, which means the churches are going to have to pay them more. And that's going to be tough with a God who's so poor that he has to go begging from tax dollars in order to do his mission. But a Jesus statue in a federal park in Montana, 10 Commandments monuments right on high school property grounds in Pennsylvania, prayer before city council meetings, lawsuits on different issues like that we're going for. But our second purpose is to educate the public about non-believers. We complain about the 10 Commandments, let's say, in that high school in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, and people say, well, but what's wrong with the Ten Commandments? Why would anybody object to the Ten Commandments? And so, well, ask us what's wrong, you know. We'll be glad to tell you. So we're often basically defensive. We're trying to say, what is it that, why is it that non-believers don't believe or don't respect what the Muslims or the Jews or the Christians or the others are trying to push in this free country? So if you want to know more about that, look up Freedom from Religion Foundation on the internet, or take one of our free newspapers here. In fact, there's a picture of Jesus on the front cover. That's that famous 1940s painting of Jesus that's hanging inside in a prominent wall space in a middle school in Jackson, Ohio. And some students were thinking, why am I seeing a picture of Jesus in my public school? And it's been hanging there since 1947, I think. Anyway, we're suing. We and the ACLU of Ohio are cooperating. We're suing that school over the Jesus. And the school is saying, we can keep it there because it's not school speech, it's student speech. The students hung it there, and who's to tell the students that they don't have free speech, right? So that's kind of how the issue is being framed. So follow that case. If you were at the debate Thursday night in Windsor, the debate was, is there life after death? So I did a lot of preparation because I've done this debate before. I debated Dinesh D'Souza. You know who that is? I debated him on this topic before. And Dinesh was better than this guy from last Thursday night. Joe Boot from Toronto. He's a pastor. And by the way, I'm going to digress a little bit. You heard the story about Dinesh D'Souza last fall? How he got kicked out of being the president of King's College. Dinesh and I have done 7 debates, or 8, I can't remember now, 7 or 8 debates. We did one October the 2nd last year in Pennsylvania, Messiah College, Christian college. And we were debating, does God exist, I think, not the afterlife. But before the debate, we met in the dining room, each dining room, with the president of Messiah College. It's a Christian college, and they were all Christians, and these Christian organizers had invited me in, and Dinesh was there. We were having dinner before the event. And there was a young woman sitting next to Dinesh at the table. And she wasn't saying much, and hardly anyone was talking to her. And so, I remember I met Dinesh's family in San Diego a couple years before, and I was thinking, have I seen her before? So I finally said, are you Dinesh's daughter? And Dinesh turned and he said, no, that's my fiance. And these other organizers, their eyebrows were raised. And he said, fiance? He told me he was bringing his assistant. And they only needed 1 hotel room. And she doesn't look like an assistant. And he said, she's my fiance. And I said, well, I remember meeting his wife. You know, she's a he's from India, and she's a non-Indian. Then the story broke out later that this is happening. He's having this, you know, and then Dinesh is saying, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with having a fiance before your divorce is final? Well, he filed for divorce on October the 4th, 2 days after our debate. So then King's College fired him, and so I actually went up to them after dinner and I congratulated him. I said, congratulations. I'm not going to moralize about your personal life. You know, maybe your marriage, I don't know. I'm not going to say anything about that. But it does seem kind of hypocritical, doesn't it? Dinesh writes these books about how immorality and adultery and divorce and infidelity are symptoms of the secular culture that we live within, and So Dinesh and I did a debate on is there life after death, and he brought up, and if you read his book, Is There Life After Death? There's only about 1 page that has any evidence. In that whole book, if you read the whole book, it's all just a diatribe against naturalism and atheism. That's all it is. But then he actually has a page where he offers evidence. You know what it is? Can you guess what would be the evidence for?
Near-death experience.
Exactly. Near-death experience. The story about the blue shoe, if you've ever heard that story. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. But, that's a whole different talk. But I was ready. I had pages crammed with notes last Thursday night because I thought Joe Boot would bring up near-death experiences. You know, the tunnel and the light and the dead relatives and all these things that people say when they... And that famous book is out, The Little Boy, Heaven is Real. You know, all these stories that you read about. Joe didn't bring that up. The other thing they offer, what do you think is the other thing they offer for life after death? What other evidence do you think they give?
Jesus.
Yeah, what about Jesus?
Scripture. Resurrection.
Oh, the Shroud of Turin or something? No.
You're right. She got 2 out of 2. The resurrection of Jesus. the historical fact of the empty tomb of Jesus. And Paul in the Bible said, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, our faith is vain. You know, the resurrection of Jesus is the biggest, that's one of the big evidences they give. Do you think Joe brought that up Thursday night? Who were at the debate? He mentioned those two things briefly, and he said, we don't need those things. You want to know what he said is the reason why there's life after death? He said, the main reason is that God exists, and God says there's life after death. So there you go. And then he turned the whole debate into, I wrote a blog about this if you want to read it. He turned the whole debate into, not is there life after death, but is atheism absurd? So if atheism is absurd, we live in a cosmos with no meaning, therefore there's life after death. You know, that was his reasoning. So tonight I want to talk about one of those two evidences, the resurrection. Supposed evidences, claims to evidence. And if somebody makes a claim to evidence, then you've got something on the table, right? You can debate it, you can rebut it. As long as you can define it coherently and understand what you're talking about, then you have a debate. And in any debate, the burden of proof is on the shoulders of the person making the claim. The burden of proof is not on the skeptic. And a lot of believers don't understand that. They think, well, you atheists have to prove there's no God, right? And, you know, you can't. Suppose I were to tell you, I have invented a perpetual motion machine. And you would say, well, Dan, prove it. Can I just fold my arms and say, prove that I didn't? Can I do that? You can't prove that I didn't, can you? Right? You can play that game with anything. If they say, well, can you prove there's no God? You can say anything you want. You can say, you are a child molester. No, I'm not. What evidence do you have? And prove that I'm not. You know, you can do the same game, right? You can say, well, if you can't prove that you're not, and then the Christian might say, well, there's no evidence that I am. Exactly, right? But with the resurrection story, there is some evidence. There's documents. There's a story. There's New Testament stories that say that Jesus rose from the dead. So we've got something on the table that we can actually look at, right? We have documents that go back to the 2nd century at least. Conservatives think the documents go back earlier than that, and they're talking about earlier times. But I have a whole chapter in my book, Godless here, on this, and so I'm going to telescope a lot of it tonight out of the interest of time, and maybe have some questions. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? I used to preach it. I used to believe it. I used to think that empty tomb of Jesus was so powerful historically that that's what motivated the early Christians to die for their faith and become martyrs. Where there's smoke, there's fire. How do you explain the worldwide impact of the life of Jesus and the growth of Christianity all over? How do you explain that unless something happened? Well, we all know something happened, right? We know that with Mormonism too, don't we? Joseph Smith and the angel Moroni and the gold tablets and the little, what are those things called? The Thurm thingies they were looking at. Mormonism is a huge worldwide movement. So we know that something happened, right? Do we think there really was an angel Moroni and there really was there, or is there maybe a natural explanation for what happened? We can say that about any religion. We could say that about any religion was claimed to happen. And with Christianity, something did happen. We have documents. They're there. And the church, to a large degree, at least since the 4th century, has been based upon those documents that we call the New Testament. There are 4 lines of argument, 4 lines of criticism that skeptics have used to question whether or not the resurrection of Jesus really happened. I'll list all 4. The first 2 are strong, but we don't need them. But the last 2 are what I want to concentrate on. They are the problem of history, and then there's the second is the natural explanations or possible natural explanations for the story. The third one is the internal contradictions within the stories, and the fourth one is the evidence of legendary growth of the story. I think 3 and 4 are stronger. 1 and 2 can throw it into doubt, but they don't disprove anything. Number 1 is the historical objection. The resurrection of Jesus might have happened. A miracle in the past might have happened. We can't rule it out, right? Maybe the laws of nature were different back then. Maybe something, we weren't there, were we? Were you there, right? You hear that a lot when it comes to evolution. Christians will say, "Were you there?" But that, you know, when you like if there was a crime and somebody's accused of it, the police say, "Well, we can't solve this crime because none of us were there." Right? You use the evidence. You use what you have. So history is all we've got. In order for history to work, it has to make some assumptions. One of the big assumptions that history has to make is that the laws of nature are constant throughout time. They might not be. The laws of nature might not be constant, but history has to assume that they are. Otherwise, you can't do history. You would just take what somebody wrote back there. If somebody said, "Oh, no, the plays of Shakespeare were not written by Francis Bacon. The plays of Shakespeare actually materialized on the table magically from nowhere." If somebody said that, would we have to put that on the table as one of the possible hypotheses for the origin of the plays of Shakespeare? If you're going to do history, you're going to assume, wait a minute, plays don't appear magically on the table now or then, so we're going to throw out that explanation. That doesn't mean that the plays of Shakespeare did not come into being that way. That doesn't mean that. What it means is that history is impotent to know it. That's all it means. So history is the wrong tool. If the miracles happened, right? And I'm not ruling out miracles with this argument. I'm just saying if they happen, history's the wrong tool for it. It'd be like looking for another planet in the solar system with a microscope. Would the microscope be the right tool? I suppose it's possible. Somebody could use a microscope to find out. But is it really the right tool? It's not. It's the wrong tool. So history's the wrong tool to determine whether or not a miracle happened in the past sometimes. Sometimes believers who hear that objection say, so you're just ruling out miracles. You have a bias against the supernatural, don't you? And we can reply, well, do you have a bias against the natural? I mean, there might be a natural explanation for it. Are you biased against that as well? History can throw into doubt a lot of these stories about what happened in the past. And I think most of us know when we are examining the ludicrous claims of other religions, we use that principle a lot, don't we? Do you think Muhammad really did take a night flight on this horse thing? What was the horse thing called? I forget the name of it. All the way to what they say was Jerusalem. Do you think that really happened, or do you think maybe it was a hallucinatory or visionary or even made up story? You know, what's more likely? Well, it's possible. I'm not saying he couldn't have flown on this horse through the middle of the night all the way across over to Jerusalem. That's possible, but if you're going to use history as a tool, you're going to make the probability of these things so low that we can rule them out and look for a more natural explanation. There's a lot more to say about that, but I have to move on here. The second line of criticism that people often offer is that the stories of the New Testament can have other explanations than a miracle. It might have seemed like a miracle to them at the time, but it was actually something else that happened. Like, he actually didn't die on the cross. He just passed out, and he thought he was dead. That's why they have wakes. That's why people go to wakes, because sometimes a dead body you thought was dead comes back to life again. You've seen movies where that happens, right? So it's possible that when Jesus was on the cross, everybody thought he was dead, but he really wasn't. There's a name for that. It's called the Swoon Theory that people have put forward. Another theory is that, well, everybody hallucinated. They were all just, when Jesus rose from the dead, they were all just, you know, a group hallucination. Another possible natural theory is that they moved the body. He was really buried there, but they moved it somewhere else, and when the women came, what's gone? He's gone, he's resurrected. And there's all these other, you know, maybe plausible theories that people have put forward to say, here's what really happened. And you can't discount any of those either. Historians never deal in 0% or 100%. Historians are always dealing in likelihoods, probabilities. If it gets high enough or low enough, you might round it off. We might round off the possibility that Shakespeare's plays pop on the table. We might say it's 0.2%, but I'm going to round it off. We do that with everything. We get confident enough to round it up or down. But what I think the problem is with these naturalistic attempts that people have brought forward, and there's a whole bunch of them, to try to explain what happened, is that I think they take the documents too seriously. They take the New Testament texts too seriously, as if those things really did happen and need a natural explanation. It's also possible that those things didn't happen at all, or that they were just misinterpreted, or that somebody was exaggerating. So I want to move to number 3 and 4. Number 3 is the fact that the documents themselves disagree with each other so radically that we really don't even know what happened. When I was a preacher, I used to preach, from Luke and from Matthew and from John. I used to talk about it. Jesus rose and he appeared unto Peter, and he appeared unto the 500, and he appeared lastly unto me. He appeared unto Paul, and so on. And I didn't realize that it isn't just one flat story. If you take the resurrection accounts, there are basically 5 of them. And when I was doing this debate in Oxford, England last November, on this house believes in God. It was a pretty fun debate, actually. They're all wearing tuxedos and bow ties, and very parliamentarian. And Michael Shermer, you know who that is? Michael Shermer. He and I and Peter Millikan, the philosopher, we went up against John Lennox, the mathematician, who was a theist, and an Anglican priest, and Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens is the brother of Christopher Hitchens, who is a believer, who is the most obnoxious debater I've ever had. It was all ad hominem from him. But John Lennox was pretty good. John Lennox was coherent, and he actually tried to make an argument. And John Lennox brought up the fact of the resurrection of Jesus. He brought up that whole idea, the empty tomb of Jesus. Here he is, this famous mathematician, and he thinks that the empty tomb of Jesus is a historical fact. And so during the debate, I mentioned that the resurrection of Jesus, and I turned to him, is the worst example anyone could ever possibly offer for the reliability of the Bible. And I'm not exaggerating, because unlike most stories that you find in the Bible, which are given maybe once or maybe twice, the resurrection story is given 5 times, plus a few little fragments of things here and there, like in Galatians where Paul talked about some. But those 5 basic stories are Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and Paul. And 1 Corinthians has about how many verses is that? 5-verse passage. So when you compare those 5 different stories, then you can look at them side by side and say, oh, well, how do they match? They don't. They don't match. What you have to do is you have to produce, and you've probably seen it, they're called New Testament harmonies, harmony of the New Testament, where they try to make them match, and they don't. Conservative scholars even agree that they can't make those stories match together. Something has got to give. And let me just give a few examples from, because I haven't memorized all of them, but I'll just give a few. What time did the women visit the tomb? Matthew said, as it began to dawn. Mark, very early in the morning at the rising of the sun, when the sun had risen. Depends on what translation you're doing. Just after sunrise. Luke said very early in the morning at early dawn, but John says when it was yet dark. So I've had Christian apologists say, well, that's not a contradiction, that the sun was shining and it was dark at the same time. How could that be a contradiction? When the women left, it was dark, but when they got there, the sun was up. Get it? They're trying to rationalize these things. Who were these women? Matthew said there was Mary Magdalene and another Mary, but Mark said it was Mary Magdalene, the mother of James and Salome. Luke said it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and some other women. John just said it was Mary Magdalene, just one. So the gospel accounts don't agree with each other on how many women or who they were. What was their purpose? Matthew said they came to see the tomb, but Mark said they'd already seen the tomb. They were bringing spices. But John said the body had already been spiced before they arrived. They disagree with each other. And here's a big one. Was the tomb open when the women arrived? Those of you who went to Sunday school, what do you think? When they got there, was it open or was it closed?
I think it was open.
Which one was it?
I'm going to say open.
Probably both.
It's both. You're right. It's both. Some of them say it was closed and some of them say it was open. Matthew, the writer of Matthew, who tended to be the most exaggerated of all the gospel writers, and Luke tended to be the most sober of them all. If you have to pick one of them, then you got to throw out Matthew. And you can stay. Luke didn't get it right either, but Luke tended to be a little more sober. Matthew tended to exaggerate a lot. Matthew said, no, when the women arrived, the tomb was closed, but then there was this huge earthquake, and then the tomb rock rolled away, and then the angels came out. But the other ones say it was already open. Luke, John, and Mark said it was already open. So how do you square that? Was it or not? It can't have been both, I suppose. By the way, the earthquake. I'll get back to contradictions, but that was the second earthquake in the story. Remember the first earthquake? When that was? On the crucifixion, there was also an earthquake. It was an earthquake that was so big that the veil of the temple was split in two, and the graves of Jerusalem opened up, and all these dead bodies came out. Matthew says. Matthew the exaggerator, right? By the way, none of the others mention an earthquake. Only Matthew mentions these two earthquakes. The others didn't mention it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. They just might not thought that important. Although you would think that an earthquake at both of those events would have been a pretty important thing. You would also think that we would have found evidence of earthquakes back then. Anything that would cause the graves to open and the curtain to rip in half would have been huge. You would have seen some evidence in the temple or some cracking or something. Besides that, there would have been houses destroyed and people killed. There would have been just this mass. What happened with huge earthquakes like that? Big enough to roll a stone away. Well, on Sunday morning, apparently there was another big earthquake, big enough to roll the stone. And yet you'll notice this through the rest of the day, everybody's walking around nonchalantly as if nothing had happened. That would have been a big national catastrophe with dead bodies and people having to be taken care of and searches conducted. But the earthquake, Matthew just throws it in there. And besides these dead bodies, they resurrected from the dead before Jesus. They resurrected a few days before. And Matthew says these dead bodies came out of the tombs. Zombies. This is more like a Halloween story, and they went back to their places. So that would be headline news. I mean, that would be something, that would have been something somebody would have noticed in history. And in fact, historians were writing in great detail about that whole area, early Roman Empire, about many lesser things than that were covered by a lot of different historians. No mention of the earthquake or this amazing story of these zombies. They went back to their, what did they go back to their wives or husbands? And what did they look like? What did they smell like? I mean, that would be an incredible story. But this earthquake came and apparently rolled the tomb away, rolled the stone away from the tomb. Who was there at the tomb when they arrived? When the women arrived, whether the stone was there or not, who was there? What did you say?
2 angels.
2 angels? Well, actually, John says there was 2 angels. You're right. Matthew said there was 1 angel. Mark said it was 1 young man. But it might have been an angel because it was a young man dressed in white, right? So maybe. Luke said there were 2 men. And where were these messengers situated? Matthew said the 1 angel was sitting on the stone. Mark said the young man was sitting on the right, inside. Luke said there was 2 men standing inside. John said there were 2 angels sitting on each end of the bed. So who they were, where they were, how many there were, these accounts differed. By the way, there's one historian, Randall Helms, is that who it was? I think it was Randall Helms, who suggests, we do know that in those early days there were a lot of traveling acting troupes. There were a lot of, it was a big entertainment of the day to put on these outdoor plays, like the Greeks used to do. Well, even out in the Roman provinces there were plays going on. There may have been people going around doing these passion plays, but one town was too poor, they could only afford 1 angel. But another town could afford 2. And one had a big acting troupe, so they had 4 women show up to you can see how maybe if it was a play that was being acted out, different people who saw that play would give a different story about what they thought was happening. I don't think he proved his point, but it is an intriguing possibility. What did the messengers say to the women? 4 different things, the messenger says. I won't go into detail, but there are 4 different things. Although Matthew, who's the funniest of all of them, talks about how he's not here, women, Jesus is not here. He's going before you to Galilee. That's where you're going to see him. You're going to see him in Galilee. And so, Matthew goes on, so they did. They went to Galilee and they saw him in Galilee. And some believed, but some doubted, he said. But the others say it's totally different about what happened. After this big event in the life of these women, did they tell what happened? Matthew said yes. Luke and John said yes. The women told. What an amazing story, right? Mark said no. Neither said they anything to any man. And that's how the the book of Mark ends. They kept their mouths shut. When Mary returned from the tomb, did she know Jesus had been resurrected? Well, Mark, Matthew, and Luke say yes, but John said no. Mary did not know Jesus had been resurrected. When did Mary first see Jesus? Matthew said, and Mark said it was before she returned to the disciples, but John said it happened after she returned to the disciples. When did that first appearance happen? Could Jesus be touched after the resurrection? Yes and no. After the women, then who did Jesus appear to next in the story? Who do you think? Who's the next people that Jesus... You're not going to get it right, so... What do you think?
The apostles?
Matthew said he appeared to 11 disciples because, you know, Judas apparently was dead. So there was not 12, there were 11. Mark said it was to 2 disciples walking in the country, and then later to 11. Remember that story? Jesus kind of disguised himself and they didn't know who they were walking with. There's the Halloween story again. He must have had a mask on. And all of a sudden he appeared to them, and then, oh, it's Jesus. And then he disappeared, and he was like, poof, like a spook. And then he went back to the 11 in Jerusalem. Luke said it was to 2 disciples in Emmaus, probably the same 2 guys. John said it was to 10 disciples because now Thomas wasn't there, right? Doubting Thomas. So it was only 10. But Paul said he appeared first to Peter and then to the 12. So what number was it? Where did that happen? Where did Jesus first appear to the disciples? Where do you think it was?
Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem? Didn't Matthew say go to Galilee? Matthew said go to Galilee, that's where you're going to see him. I always thought it was in a room in Jerusalem. But in Matthew, the first appearance was on a mountain in Galilee. Galilee is quite a ways away. So depending where you are, it's at least 60 to 100 miles away from Jerusalem, where these things supposedly happen. So apparently, on Easter morning, Jesus' body is missing, and this angel, or 1 or 2 angels, or 2 men said to whoever these women are, and Matthew said, he's not here, but you go see him in Galilee. So according to Matthew, they did. They went up to Galilee, and they saw him, but some doubted. Why would they have doubted if they had already seen him before? How did they get up there that fast? Even if you get on a blazing fast horse, how fast can you go on a racing horse to get 60 miles away? It's going to take you a couple hours, right, or more? Yeah, to get up there. If all 12 of them had a horse that they could raise up, you know. I had a pastor tell me once, well, you know, it could have been like teleportation. It could have been that they got up there. All the way up to Galilee. And some scholars are convinced that because in the early church there was a fight over where the true center of Christianity was it in the north or the south? And some of those writers were trying to make sure, Matthew wanted to be sure, Galilee's the place where it all happened, right? But Mark said it was to those 2 people walking in the country on the road to Emmaus. That's just north of Jerusalem. You could walk there, I guess, in a couple hours to go up to Emmaus. Luke said it was in Emmaus. That's about 7 miles away. But then he came back that evening to a room in Jerusalem. John said it was in a room at evening. So it wasn't in Galilee. It was at a room probably somewhere in Jerusalem area, right? So where was it? Was it in Jerusalem or was it in Galilee? Take your pick. Those authors disagree with each other. I suppose you could imagine some horribly madcap scene where, you know, Matthew told them, go tell the disciples, although the women didn't say anything, somehow they told the disciples to get on a horse and get up to Galilee really, really fast, and then Jesus is going to appear to you, and then get back on the horse and get right back before dinner time, and you can then Jesus will appear to you. And I suppose that could have happened that way, but it kind of stretches credulity. Those 2 men on the road, did they believe? Did the disciples believe those 2 men? Mark said no, they didn't believe them. They thought they were lying. Luke said yeah, they did believe them. What happened at this first appearance of Jesus? Matthew said that the disciples worshipped and some doubted, and then Jesus said, go preach. Go out and preach the gospel. Which is one of the reasons why I was a preacher, because of that verse. Go into the world and preach the gospel. But in Mark, Jesus reprimanded them. He called them out. In Luke, we have this kind of Jesus incognito in the vanishing act, and then he materialized out of thin air, and then he balls them out and reprimands the disciples, and then he sits down and has dinner. In John, Jesus passed through a solid door, The disciples are happy. There's no reprimand. There's no bawling them out. Jesus blesses them instead of reprimanding them. And did Jesus stay around for a while after that? What do you think? Did you go to Sunday school at all? Did Jesus stay around? Mark said nope. It all happened. He went up and he was ascended exactly on that day. Luke, if you read Luke all the way through, no. He went out and he had the dinner with these guys, and it was a great time. And then, hate to eat and run, but then he went out and ascended to heaven. John said he was on earth at least 8 days after that. And in the book of Acts, when Luke is writing the books of Acts, he said it was at least 40 days. 40 days that he hung around. So when was it? How was it? How many days did he stay? I've debated some apologists who try to fit all these pieces together. And, you know, see, in this verse it said they had supper and he ascended, but there was a 40-day gap between that comma. And what was he doing those 40 days? According to the Mormons, he must have gone to America and, you know, preached to the Indians or something. I don't know. But the ascension of Jesus into heaven, where did that take place? Now this one you should get.
Mount of Olives.
Mount of Olives? You know a lot. You've studied this a lot, haven't you?
Former Christian.
Former Christian. Matthew doesn't even mention the ascension. He mentions the earthquake, but he doesn't mention an ascension. It's just that go out and preach the gospel. So there's no ascension at all. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just ends on the mountain. It just ends in Galilee, on the mountain. That's where Matthew's gospel just ends. The angel said, go to Galilee, you'll see him there. They went there. Some of them doubted, but then he preached. He balls them out and he preaches, and then that's the end. Go preach the word. But Mark, it was in or near Jerusalem right after supper. In Luke, he was in a town called Bethany, not in Jerusalem, right after supper. John doesn't mention an ascension at all into heaven. Neither does Paul. But in Acts, you're right, it says it happened in the Mount of Olives, in the book of Acts, not in one of the Gospels. So there's a whole bunch of these problems internally, and if any of you want some of those details, and you're too cheap to buy my book, I have a handout here that has them all listed out. So you're welcome to take one of these. And it's an Easter challenge, and for years I've issued this challenge that not to prove that the resurrection happened, but just to tell what happened. Before you prove it, either way, just tell what happened. Take all the gospel accounts of the resurrection, start at Easter morning. Easter's coming up, isn't it? In a couple of weeks? Yeah. You went to that rabbit recovery. What did you go to? The rabbit recovery?
Retreat.
They're going to need that retreat, I think.
Rescue.
Rabbit rescue. But start on Easter morning in the Gospels and in Paul's thing in 1 Corinthians. And just write a narrative. Don't try to prove it or disprove it. Just write down, before we even start, write down what happened. This happened first, this happened next. Jesus said this, they said that, then this happened, and then that. Just like a narrative, like you're telling the story, right? And don't omit anything. And there's not that many verses. You can read through all those accounts in, I don't know, 15 minutes. You can probably read through all of them. And then just put it together and just write a simple narrative that doesn't contradict itself about what happened, and this was when. And if you want to, put some parentheses in there with some remarks of explanation. You can do that, right, to explain, because sometimes history has to do that. Sometimes historians take what one writer wrote and compare it to what another writer wrote, and they need to explain something. So you can do that. Then write the whole thing and don't omit one single detail, and then tell us what happened. And you know what? No one's done that. That has never been done. Even conservative scholars agree you can't do it without doing drastic damage to the text itself. I've had people send in these elaborate things that, well, you see the stone, the women came and the stone was there, but then they went back home and had breakfast. And then they came back. They insert all these things in there to say, here's what could have happened, right? And then they came back and the stone was moved. But if you read Matthew, it all happened in their presence. In fact, if you read these gospel writers, and this is very telling, all of them as writers, whether this is right or wrong, whether they're making it up or not, whether it's true or false, all of them as writers really wanted to tell a story, and all of them were careful to put time markers in their narrative. Look at the chapter before that, and you'll find things, and after this, it was said unto them. And then, and following this, that you find all these time markers that are very explicit. If you don't look for them, you don't see it, but if you were to go through the New Testament and just mark them, this happened, and so you take between these two things as one narrative, and between these two markers as another. Well, that story about the stone was within these two markers. It said on the first day of the week, there's a time marker, right? On the first day of the week comes Mary to the tomb. That's starting a story, and then it goes all the way to another time marker. So there was no space in there where, according to the writer, that the women decided, they would have said, and after this, they went home unto their breakfasts. And then, you know, that's how they wrote. You're going to have to assume that for some reason, they broke their writing styles in order to make these pieces all fit together. It's never been done. No one's ever put it together coherently. At least one of those writers got something wrong, or maybe two, or maybe all of them got something wrong. Then I'll get to the fourth point, and then we'll try to... This is actually what I think is the strongest. Because those first 3 points throw considerable doubt on the story, but they don't disprove it, do they? It could have happened in spite of the problems with history. It could have happened in spite of our understanding of natural events. It could have happened even though they were contradictory. Maybe one of them got it right, right? So it could have happened. Maybe one of them was telling the truth. But many critics and many scholars are convinced that the resurrection story is a legend. Some are convinced that it's a myth, that it never even happened at all. I have a lot of sympathy with the mythicists, but I don't want to go there tonight. I'm going to assume, just like with Joseph Smith and the gold tablet, that there was something that happened. Some event happened that later got elaborated or exaggerated and misinterpreted. You can have a legend with or without a historical fact. If it's a myth, you can still have a legend. If there's a history there, you can still have a legend because it exaggerates. Remember the story of Elian Gonzalez, that Cuban kid who was found floating up to Miami? Remember that whole story? Within 2 or 3 days, this huge, elaborate story came about. The dolphins and the angels and the Virgin Mary was walking down the streets of Miami, and all this, within just a couple of days, this original story that did happen, I mean, it really did, got blown up. You know the story of Medjugorje in former Yugoslavia, where this young girl said she saw the Virgin Mary. Within like half a day, people were coming to that place to get healed. The word spread, and suddenly there was all these stories. Quick, did she really see the Virgin Mary? Do you think she did? I doubt she did, but thousands of people believed it, and even now, there's still this, it's like a holy place now where the Virgin Mary appeared. So something might have happened. Who knows what? A story started or something. And from that point, the legend can grow. And the story itself contains within it the footprints of legend. And here's how we know that. If you take all the accounts that we have of the resurrection of Jesus and put them in order in which they were written, you start first of all with Paul. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 wrote this thing that he said was handed to him from someone else. Was delivered unto me. So he was passing on an oral report, and it's about 5 verses that says that Jesus died, and then he was raised from the dead, and then he appeared unto Peter, unto Cephas, and then he appeared unto the 500, and then he appeared unto me. So obviously he was editing that, because if he was passed to him from someone else, his own story wouldn't have been a part of it. So obviously he stuck his own story at the end of that thing. That thing reads like a liturgy or like a formula. It reads kind of like a poetic thing that people would be saying orally. And a lot of times in religious, people would make these oral things that they could remember, like a song. They would, or a psalm or a poem or something. And one of the arguments we sometimes get from Christians about why the New Testament is reliable history is that it's not written in a legendary style. It's written just as plain history, whereas the Odyssey and these other things were written in more legendary, and you can tell that the New Testament was just telling a story. Well, that little piece that Paul gives us was written in a kind of a legendary style. Paul wrote his epistles before any of the Gospels. Paul wrote his epistles sometime in the year 50 to 55 1 Corinthians would have been around the year 55 or so, which is what? Depending on when these events supposedly happened, in the year 28 to 33 or something, and we don't even know that because there's two contradictory birth dates for Jesus. There's a 9-year gap there. That's a different story. It would have been, what, 25 years later, right? It would have been about 25 years after the events. The very first thing we have written about the resurrection is this little 5-verse passage, a quarter of a century later. Now keep this in mind when you're thinking about how this develops. In first century Rome, life expectancy was about 45 years old. So the disciples of Jesus, if the story happened, how old might they have been? Maybe in their 20s? What do you think? Luke was a tax collector, so he might have been older, in his 30s or something. Some people live more than 45, but on average, 45 was about the life expectancy. So 25 years later, Paul writes this thing in 1 Corinthians that somebody handed to him. Maybe there was an early tradition from 20-some years later before. There might have been. Something might have happened back then, and then this oral tradition gets passed to Paul. 25 years later, he writes it down to the church in Corinth. Corinth, and Corinthian, was across from Greece, the Corinthian, the sea there. To get to Corinth by land is about 1,500 miles, okay? So here's these people, 1,500 miles away, which in those days was really far away, getting this letter from Paul about something that happened 25 years ago from people they didn't even know of and couldn't check what happened. Paul writes in there that he appeared to Cephas and he appeared to, I forgot all the names, but he appeared to the 500. 500 people? That sounds like a pretty big list. No names. 500 sounds kind of like a suspicious round number too, doesn't it? But apparently these 500 people never wrote a thing about it. These 500 people never did anything to explain it, but apparently Paul says these 500 people saw it. And then he appeared to me. So that's the earliest thing we have written about the resurrection. The next thing we have is Mark. Mark wrote his gospel around the year 70, okay? So now, how many years away is that? That's about 40 years after the event. Mark, the first gospel, writes his. Then we have Matthew and Luke, which are pretty close together. Matthew and Luke obviously borrowed from Mark. They used Mark as one of their sources when they wrote. You can tell. Historians know that Matthew and Luke were paralleling and using a lot of Mark as one of the things. And then, this was around the year 80 to 85. Matthew was probably in 80, Luke was probably in 85. So how far away are we from the events? Then John was the last one. John wrote his gospel sometime after the year 90. Some people say it was in the 2nd century, but somewhere in the year 90, 95, let's say. How long after the events was that? You often hear stories about how Christ's message was so powerful that the disciples went out and they were martyred, they were killed, they were persecuted for their faith. Well, if they all died these horrible persecuted deaths, how did any of them live long enough to have written these first-person accounts of what happened way, way, way back there? And in those days, that was way, way, way back there. So here's the footprint. If you take these accounts in the order they were written, and then however you want to count it, you can use your own criteria. Count up the number of extraordinary events in each one of those things. And by extraordinary event, you can pick what you want. I think an angel is an extraordinary event, don't you? I think an angel, I think an ascension is a historical event. I don't think an empty tomb is. I mean, that could be, that wouldn't be that extraordinary. I don't even think a hallucination is that extraordinary. There are atheists who hallucinate, so a hallucination I wouldn't count. But however you want to count them, tally up how many extraordinary events you find in each of those 5 accounts. In Paul, you have 0. In Mark, you have maybe 1, and that would be the young man at the tomb, if that young man was an angel. Let's assume that the young man in white was an angel, because I think that's how they liked to describe angels back in those days. If you see a young man who's not supposed to be there and he's dressed in white, well, that's an angel, right? Then in Matthew, we have 2, and then in Luke we have 2, and then what was the numbers there? I got them all wrong here. It's been so many years since I was preaching. Mark said it was 1 young man. Matthew said it was 1 angel. Luke said it was 2 men. And John said it was 2 angels. So can you see that kind of exaggerating through time? And you find a lot of these other events that you also see exaggerating through time. The earlier ones don't have ascensions in them. There's no mention of the ascension in Paul or in Mark, but then we find ascensions later. So you see that as the time passes, you see the legend is getting more exaggerated as it goes. And you expect that. You expect that with stories that grow over time. You see that happening. The mistake that I used to make when I was a preacher, and what a lot of Christians make today, is they look back through history through the lens of John, and they look back through the whole thing, and they treat the whole thing as if it were flat. They telescope it as if all of it happened and was written kind of at once, right? And that's how I thought. I would take Mark and John and compare the two as if they were kind of like buddies who were sitting next to each other writing their stories, right? But that's not how that story developed across time. There are some scholars who think the dates that I just gave should be pushed earlier. Those are conservative scholars. They think the dates should be pushed a lot closer. There are other scholars who think the dates should be pushed later, because we can't be totally sure about the exact dates of them. But no matter where you shift that, you're still going to have the same curve. It might be a steeper curve, and we know from other stories that these myths can exaggerate pretty quickly over time. We know that human beings can exaggerate these stories even just a few days later. So when you're talking about years and decades and almost a century passing, you can see how a story could migrate and change. Now, some of you might be questioning, why did I say that Paul had no extraordinary events? Didn't he say Jesus rose from the dead and he appeared unto the disciples? Wouldn't that be an extraordinary event, that somebody rose from the dead? If you look at that earliest account in 1 Corinthians 15, there's two important words in there. There's a lot of words, of course, well, there's three actually. The word buried, etaphi, he was buried. Paul doesn't mention a tomb or a sepulcher. That word doesn't show up till later. In Paul's writing, if you just read it, he was buried in the ground. It could have been a tomb, you know, but it was only rich people who would do that, and why do that with a common criminal? So, but it's ambiguous. So there's no sepulcher, there's no tomb with a stone in front of it that you would have in the later ones. In Paul, you just have this simple, he was buried. And then he was raised. That phrase, that word he was raised that Paul talks about, is not the word resurrected. Paul knew the word resurrected. He used it a lot. That was anastasis, anistemi. He was resurrected. Paul didn't use that word. He used the word egiro. He was raised. That's the word for waking up, for being quickened. When Jesus was asleep on the boat during the storm, remember that? The disciples came and he was raised. They woke him up. That word egiro is used a lot for being spiritually awakened. In fact, Paul even talks about Christians, you need to wake up and rise from the dead. He didn't use the word resurrection. He's talking about living people being raised, being their spirits raised. What most likely happened was that the early followers of Jesus, after he was crucified, believed that Jesus was raised spiritually. Not bodily, but spiritually. Kind of like how Christians will say, Grandma died and went to heaven. Does anyone think Grandma crawled out of the grave? I mean, I'd like to see that. No one thinks that Grandma actually crawled out and went, ascended. Grandma's spirit went to heaven. So the most likely explanation for this whole choice of words and what happened and what people believed in there was that the early Christians did believe that their Savior had ascended to heaven spiritually, not as a body. Paul didn't use the word resurrection. In fact, a few verses later in that same thing, he says, flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom of God. He says that pretty clearly. So Paul himself is not writing about a tomb with a stone rolling away. He's not even writing about some body coming out of a tomb. He was buried and he ascended into heaven. But what about that word appeared? Then he appeared unto Peter, he appeared unto James, he appeared unto the 500. That word appeared is a crucial word. The word it's a past participle in Greek. It's ophthi from the verb orao. And the word orama is the word for vision. That word appeared, ophthi, just means an appearance. It doesn't mean you went up and shook his hands. It means it was like a manifestation. He used that word appeared. And to prove that that was what was meant is that the same word was used by the same writer describing the transfiguration of Jesus. You know that story from the Bible? Where Jesus took Peter and Paul, and Peter and James, and who else did he take?
John.
And John. Took them up to the mount, And then, guess who appeared to them up there? Moses and Elijah appeared to them. The same word, ophthi. Moses and Elijah appeared to Peter, James, and John. And then Jesus, when they came down, said, don't tell anybody about this vision. He used the same word, vision, orama. Does anybody think that Moses and Elijah were bodily there? Or was it more of a spectral appearance that it was supposed to be had? Should we look for the empty tomb of Moses? Did Elijah crawl out of the grave and now his body is somewhere up on top of that mountain? Even in the text itself, it's using it as a visionary experience, not a bodily experience. Think about this, and I'm going to have to wrap up here pretty soon. In the entire New Testament, regarding Jesus, that word appeared only appears, after Easter. Before the story of Jesus about his life and his miracles and all this stuff and the walking on water and even the crucifixion, all that stuff, you just find it described in normal narrative terms. Jesus was seen, he was followed, he was touched, he saw, he said, he did that. It's never described as appeared. And in fact, even when Jesus was floating across the water, remember when he was walking on the water and the disciples looked and they thought they saw a ghost, but they didn't use the word appeared. He was really a person. In fact, they were proving the point that it wasn't a ghost by not using the word appeared. They didn't say that. They said it could have been a vision, but no, he was a real body. So it's only after Easter that you find that strange word appeared. What if I told you that, oh yeah, my neighbor's home now? Well, how do you know? Well, because I went over to his house and I knocked on the front door and he appeared unto me. And then I went into the dining room and he showed himself unto me. You'd think I was talking about a haunted house, right? Not like I went and touched him. It's funny how the language changes at Easter morning, and suddenly you don't have this normal stuff. It's all these spiritual rising and appearances. And as you read through the resurrection accounts, you'll see that word appeared and showed himself again. In fact, in John, Jesus supposedly went up to Galilee again, and they said this was the third time that he appeared to them. So in these 40 days, if he was there for 40 days, he appeared to them 3 different times. It wasn't like he hung out with them. It wasn't like he was a guy that... and we know that what Paul meant by the word appeared. Because remember, he told that he appeared to all these people, he appeared to 500, and he appeared to me. Well, if you look at Paul's own story, and it's actually told 3 different times. What happened when Paul apparently met Jesus? Did he meet the bodily Jesus? When he was on the road to Damascus. When he was, you know the story, he was on the road to Damascus, and he was knocked off his horse, although actually there was no horse in the story. Do you picture a horse? You hear that story? I do. That shows the power of legend making, doesn't it? Because I think there was a horse, but there's no horse. But Paul even was knocked blind, and in one account, the disciples said that they didn't hear a voice, and in another account says they did. Paul didn't see anything. He didn't meet Jesus. It was a voice from heaven, and he didn't see anything because he was blind anyway. And if we take Paul's own story about how Jesus appeared to him, we don't have a physical appearance. What was this? How many years later was this when this happened? It might have been 5, 10, 15 years later when Paul had his road to Damascus experience. Paul never met Jesus, and you can tell from Paul's writings that he doesn't ever mention a single deed or miracle of Jesus. He doesn't mention anything Jesus ever said except to repeat that Last Supper formula. Paul actually didn't know Jesus. He didn't meet him. He wasn't one of the in crowd, but some scholars are convinced that's why he put this into the story, to make him be one of the in crowd too. He appeared to them, he appeared to me, so you can trust me. His appearance was not a bodily appearance. He even writes later in the book of Galatians that when it pleased God to reveal his Son in me, he talked about it. It was an inner experience. It was a spiritual thing. He didn't meet an actual body. He had a visionary inner experience of being appeared to by Jesus appeared to him. That happens today. People think Jesus talks to them. I thought Jesus talked to me. But that doesn't mean I went up and shook hands with him, right? So, did Jesus really rise from the dead? No. If you have to bet, what would you say? You can't rule out the possibility that the story has some truth in it, and that maybe there is a heaven and a hell, and that Jesus, like Grandma, ascended to heaven. Can you rule that out? If you're biased against the supernatural, you will. But it's very possible that those early followers thought there was a spiritual ascension to heaven.
But when you look at the later stories about Thomas touching his side and these later things that come, we have to take these later embellished, exaggerated stories from John and others with a grain of salt, because it's obviously the result, as we can see, of the process of legendary embellishment. So historians have to make a judgment call. If it's more than 0.5, we can round it up and say it's likely. If it's more than 0.95, we would say, all right, I'm going with it. If it's less than 0.5, or if it's less than unlikely, we say, let's round it off. I think the likelihood that Jesus actually rose from the dead is so low, based on these facts, that we can round it off safely and say, no, he did not. There was a belief in it. Historically and physically, he did not rise from the dead.